Hello everyone, this is part of What If Naruto was trained by Black Zetsu. This story is made by livezinshadowz, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Please note that this Zetsu is not canon. Zetsu. He will have roughly the same personality and techniques, but his history is not the same, nor is he a member of Akatsuki. LLL. When faced with that which you don't know the answer, is it the honest bluntness of truth or the comforting deception of lies you seek? LLL. The land of fire was a country renowned for its dense foliage and warm climate. Trees grew in excess of hundreds of feet tall, creating a dense canopy which offered shady respite from the sweltering heat of the sun. Thick limbs branched out from tree trunks, creating a web of fulcrums and resting points that ninja, whether citizens of Konohagakure or invaders from foreign nations, often used for speedy traveling. In all honesty, it was Zetsu's favorite place to visit. Visit, of course, was a rather loose term, especially considering that Zetsu was a Nukenin, a rogue shinobi. Fortunately, his former home of Kasagakure, the village hidden in grass, had never disclosed to the rest of the world that he was missing, so Zetsu found himself able to freely enjoy the bounties of the world around him. For the most part, anyway. True freedom would require overcoming two major obstacles. First was the fact that Kusa, while unwilling to reveal its soiled hands to the world by announcing Zetsu's existence, was still trying to hunt him down. The ninja of the grass weren't exactly renowned for their skill, and while leading them on wild goose chases was highly entertaining in one respect, knowing that they were always out looking for him was a bit of a mood killer. Still, they were easy enough to thwart, and he'd even managed to make a solid meal out of their foolhardiness several times in the past, so it wasn't exactly an all-bad situation. Even still, Zetsu tended to be careful to stay away from others, not just because it was easier for his life to pick his own battles, but because the former grass shinobi struck a terrifying figure to even the hardiest of ninja. His skin was jewel-toned, the left side a pure, snow white, the right side pitch black, a perfect bisect accented by small white nubs on the black half that paralleled the midline split. The man's face reflected the duality of his skin. The only feature on the black half was a pupil-less yellow eye, wide and unblinking. The white side's eye was normal, white sclera, yellow iris, accompanied by a brow, lid, and pupil. Part of a nose was visible on the white side, set above half a mouth filled with rounded teeth. His hair was a light green, the color of cut grass, and encasing his body was a gigantic Venus flytrap, the green jaws poised to shut over his head. He had learned to accept his inhuman appearance over time, mainly because of the great gifts that came with it. One of them, Kujiro, the mayfly technique, allowed Zetsu to merge with any plant life, including the ground, through plant roots, and travel at incredible speeds. It was one of the reasons the land of fire appealed to him. There were so many things he could meld into that his options were practically infinite. Plus, as a former hidden grass shinobi, he was well versed in different flora, so the wide variety present through the country fascinated him. He told himself that the fact that these particular surroundings made his plant side most comfortable had nothing to do with why he frequented the area as often as he did. That would be admitting that that part of him had a say in how he lived, and the two personalities he already possessed were quite enough as it was. "I'm hungry," he whined aloud, voice childishly petulant. There was no external response, not that he expected one, but after a moment of silent debate, the plant man decided that he was going to indulge himself. While he normally survived by either stealing food or feasting off the lay of the land, the peckish need for fresh human flesh was surfacing again. Normally, Konoha's citizens were relatively well protected, and it was honestly a little troublesome to infiltrate the village, pick off a human, and either fight them because shinobi tasted better than civilians, or risk being discovered and swarmed by other ninja, but it had been a long time since he'd eaten any Konoha nin. I wonder if they still have that nice tangy flavor the last one had. He looked over and spied a shrub of dahlias. Though Hanakotoba, the language of flowers, was not one of his more knowledgeable plant subjects, he did know that dahlias represented good taste. The irony of the flower's meaning struck him as lucky, even if he was intentionally interpreting the meaning of taste to be delicious, instead of refined perception. A dark laugh emanated from him as the Venus flytrap closed around his head and he sank into the earth. LLL. Zetsu had found his target, a short boy, not yet into his teenage years, with messy blonde hair held back by a pair of big green goggles. His choice in clothing was terrible, an orange outfit with a thick white collar that clashed terribly with his bright hair, and even Zetsu, who stood out like a sore thumb in his own right, couldn't believe that the boy had lived for so long wearing something that just screamed, "Kill me." But if the clothing insisted, Zetsu was happy to oblige. It wasn't that the blonde was his first choice. Children were often unfulfilling as far as meals went. But Konoha was a crowded place, and after discreetly watching passers-by from the safety of an oak tree for almost 15 minutes, Zetsu had given up on trying to pick a meal off the street. He had then moved on to the outskirts of the mighty village, scouting out the training fields in the vain hope of finding someone. Previous visits had taught him that Leaf Shinobi normally visited the fields in teams, Jonin with a Jonin instructor, for instance, or pairs, Chunin or Jonin, so the odds of finding a victim alone had been relatively small. But lo and behold, the ex-grass shinobi had been presented with this boy, kicking and punching a post with all his might, which was arguably not much. While the child didn't appear to pose much in the way of a decent meal, people watching had only made him hungrier to a point where being picky was no longer an option. Besides, he could always try again after this appetizer. It was a bit of an anomaly, Zetsu considered as he merged into the ground, that this boy was by himself. Most Konoha shinobi believed in camaraderie and the will of fire, a faith Zetsu personally found to be misguided. Life's harsh lessons had taught the former Kusa-nin that the only person one could rely on was oneself. To find a boy, clearly on the path to become a shinobi, if not one already, although foregoing the traditional forehead protector if he was one, who seemed to embrace Zetsu's philosophy and not the popular one of his village was intriguing. That the boy was going to be his meal was surely a pitiable coincidence. Feeding time. LLL. Uzumaki Naruto punched the training post in front of him, venting his anger through his fists. It had been one of those days where nothing seemed to go his way. First, Sakura had turned him down again when he'd asked her on a date, and had then proceeded to ignore his existence for the remainder of the day. Then the class had had taijutsu practice, where Sasuke had thoroughly outclassed him and made him look bad in front of everyone, including Sakura. After that, Iruka had yelled at him for a solid 5 minutes for falling asleep during class, giving him an hour's detention, amidst the tittering of his classmates, for his inattention. But what could he do? Sakura liked Sasuke, though he couldn't really understand why, and Naruto hated people like the stuck-up Uchiha, so he wasn't going to try to change to be more like him, even if it was to get the girl. He'd been alone all his life, with no family or clan to teach him any special techniques or styles, so finding a way to improve his skills to beat anyone else in his class was rather difficult. And it wasn't his fault that history was boring. All in all, Naruto thought it almost impossible for the day to get any worse. Taking a quick breather, he placed his hands on his knees and scowled at the ground, mad at the unfairness of the world. It was the only thing that saved him from certain death. Naruto stumbled backwards and tripped over his own feet as a pair of enormous green jaws burst from the earth and snapped shut where he'd just been standing. The attack had occurred with almost no warning, just the ground bulging with a jagged, teeth-like pattern on whatever was surfacing. That and years of avoiding being captured by the people he pranked had taught the blonde to act before asking questions, and one panicked decision later, he was sitting on his rear, still alive. The green thing in front of him growled. It opened to reveal a man's face, if it could be called that, with yellow eyes and green hair, his skin an even split of black and white. "You moved," whined the human creature thing. Its voice sounded almost childish but decidedly masculine, younger than Naruto would have expected given his size and appearance. "How did he see us?" What are you?" stammered Naruto, pointing a shaky finger straight at the man. "Who?" corrected a dark, throaty voice tainted with malice, a complete contrast to the first voice. Naruto looked around, half expecting to see something else emerging from the ground prepared to eat him. Spying nothing, he returned his gaze to the man in front of him in time to see the white side's eye blink with apparent confusion. "We are Zetsu," spoke the first voice, seemingly offended, "and we are a who, not a what." The man's mouth moved when this voice spoke, so Naruto assumed he was actually speaking, though it didn't explain where the other voice came from. "We," Naruto managed weakly. There's more than one of you. Then, baffled, what? We are a person and therefore a who, snarled the darker voice. Watching the so-called person, Naruto noticed that unlike when the lighter voice spoke, the white side's mouth didn't move for this other voice. It was just a guess, but, are you the black side? Can we eat him now? He's irritating me. I don't wanna anymore, replied the white side, almost petulant, and Naruto heaved a sigh of relief. At least that part of this weird person liked him. Wait, eat me. Not yet anyway. Maybe not, Naruto retracted mentally, unsure how to react. The black half growled something inaudible, luring the other side into an argument. Naruto climbed slowly to his feet, deciding to make his escape while this man was occupied with himself. He turned around and began to sneak away. He bumped into something solid. Where do you think you're going? No longer submerged in the ground, and more importantly, somehow right in front of him, stood his would-be predator. Piercing yellow eyes stared down at Naruto from between the massive jaws of what, upon closer inspection, appeared to be some sort of plant. It encased the man from his waist to at least 2 feet above his head. He was clothed only in blue sweatpants, bandages wrapped around his ankles and regulation shinobi sandals on his feet, both of which were, strangely enough, white. Despite the fact that he was surely about to die, Naruto's mouth was faster than his body and brain. How did you get here so fast? The moment the words slipped past his lips, he almost slapped himself for his own stupidity. That would be the last thing he'd say. But nothing happened. He opened one eye, when did I even close them, to see the plant man staring at him with something akin to curiosity. Tell me, child, why are you out here by yourself? Naruto scowled, closing the eye again to try and rid himself of the reminder that he was perpetually alone, and crossed his arms. I've always been by myself, he grumbled dully. Everyone in the village hates me. But one day I'll be Hokage, and then they'll all have to respect me. Instead of the ridicule that usually greeted this proclamation, dead silence rang through the training area. The blonde opened his eyes to find that the strange person was no longer there. He debated with himself on whether or not to report the man's presence to anyone, but then decided against it. Even if someone did believe him, which was unlikely, he had no real evidence that anyone else had even been in the area, let alone an idea of where he'd gone. The whole incident felt so surreal that Naruto wondered if the plant man hadn't just been a figment of his imagination. Maybe I'll just go home now. LLL. We should have eaten the child. There's no guarantee he won't say anything to Konoha's hierarchy. You worry too much. And even if he does say anything, what's it matter? No one in the village can catch us. His black side laughed. True, the Konoha nin are fools. Zetsu ate the second of 2 deer he had killed, mulling over his recent discovery of the blonde boy. Humans tasted much better than venison, but the deer meat would at least temporarily sate his appetite. There was much for him to think about. It was unheard of for him to leave a target alive simply because there had never been a reason to. Zetsu's darker side didn't understand why the child had been left alive, a scary thought, considering that he was the more intellectual and rational half, but then again, his lighter half couldn't exactly explain the reason either, and he had been the one to make the decision. It had been a flight of fancy, that was all. There was nothing to be accomplished by not eating him. In fact, it was more dangerous to not kill him. But something in the way the blonde had stood his ground against Zetsu, and in the momentary glimpse at his life, struck a chord within the plant man. Forced isolation. It wasn't quite the same philosophy Zetsu himself lived by, even if it was his lifestyle, having no alternative but to go into solitude to live his life, but it was merely a stone's throw away from his personal motto. There were differences, of course, in that the ex-grass shinobi had entered isolation to begin his life anew, while the blonde child was essentially trapped in his current, confined role, but those were arbitrary distinctions. The child had potential. His intelligence left something to be desired, though it hadn't taken him overly long to figure out Zetsu was 2 personalities in one, but then again, his own childishness had been insufferable at first, too, so that could be overlooked. More interesting was that the boy's youth and seeming pariah status meant he could easily be molded to the viewpoint of whoever gave him attention first. That was an intriguing prospect. Zetsu avoided all allegiance to either village or person, mostly because it contradicted what he believed in. The mere idea that he was almost considering teaching the blonde to embrace his ideals was practically blasphemous. There was nothing to be gained by undergoing such a venture. So why did he still feel a strange lure to do something? There are only two options, growled his dark side. Either we leave and find a good meal to forget everything, or, echoed his other half. The thought was left unfinished. Talking out loud was Zetsu's way of reasoning through things both halves were conflicted on. It wasn't a particularly often occurrence anymore, but the method was still helpful when it did happen. Still, some things, he found, were better left unsaid. We go back. LLL. Using the Kajiro, Zetsu spent the next 3 days merged with all sorts of flora, watching the blonde child he had tried eating go through the rigors of everyday life. Granted, his life was unbelievably mundane, but Zetsu found it interesting that what the boy had told him actually appeared to be quite true. He would wake up and go to the academy from morning until mid-afternoon, where he would then head out to the training field Zetsu had met him in when he didn't serve detention. After that, he would sit down to dinner at a place called Ichiraku Ramen, where he would down several bowls of noodles and broth. As boring as his routine was, the child was a prime candidate for Zetsu's philosophy. For the most part, the rest of his class either jeered at his mistakes or ignored him to the best of their abilities. Whispers followed him as he walked through the streets, snide remarks and cruel barbs tailing him like his own shadow. He was already ostracized from society. With a push in the right direction, he could very easily be manipulated into Zetsu's way of thinking. The only issue the plant man could find with this peculiar development was that interacting with the boy would mean contradicting the same philosophy he was trying to teach. On the one hand, it would be interesting to pass on his way of thinking to a fresh ninja who could be sculpted as he saw fit. On the other hand, doing so went against everything he knew. Unless, Zetsu believed that the only person one could rely on was oneself. Technically, he wasn't putting his faith in the child, merely tutoring him in his own worldviews and ninja know-how. As long as the former Kusa-nin remained reliant upon his own abilities, he wasn't breaching his beliefs. Satisfied with that logic, the next step would be to see if the boy was actually willing to be taught by him. Which was why, as the sun set on the third day of Zetsu's observation, he moved from a tree to the ground, surfacing 20 feet away from where the blonde boy, Naruto, he'd learned, was repeatedly hitting the same training post. His appearance startled Naruto from his training, and Zetsu watched him hesitate in his motions, preparing, he guessed, to flee at the slightest sign of movement. The Nukanen remained half-merged with the ground, keeping only his torso and above visible to the blonde. You didn't run, Zetsu noted. There was a long pause, and then the boy shook his head. Brave little fool, aren't you? When Zetsu didn't say anything else, Naruto took a tentative step backwards. You're not gonna eat me, are you? Both sides of the plant man responded in the negative, the duality of the voices putting the blonde even more on edge. Blue eyes darted around, still looking for a chance to escape. Almost being eaten had apparently raised his hackles. Zetsu mused idly. So why are you here? Zetsu grinned. With his altered appearance and blunted teeth, the gesture was grotesque. The fact that the child was nervous around him boded well for the respect he could garner through fear. We came to make you an offer. Would you be interested in learning from us? That stopped Naruto in his tracks. His nerves calmed, at least a little, with the knowledge that he, apparently, wasn't about to become this man's meal, but his mind began spinning at the offer. You wanna train me? The yellow eye on the plant man's white side blinked. Naruto paused before giving a response, considering the idea. This man was clearly a skilled shinobi, capable of escaping the watchful eye of Konoha's own ninja and possessing talents Naruto had never seen before. He was offering to essentially become Naruto's private tutor, something the blonde was sorely lacking and desperate to have. But things generally didn't come without a price. What do you get out of this? And why me? When you're sad and alone, all you can count on is yourself. Naruto cocked his head curiously, clearly not understanding. Zetsu sighed, his dark side annoyed. You've been alone a long time, empathized the white half. Such a lifestyle should have taught you that relying on other people is a foolish endeavor. Naruto nodded, either missing or ignoring the fact that he was going to be reliant upon this strange man. So what are you gonna teach me? Oh, what about the way you pop up in places? Can you teach me that? Zetsu blinked in surprise. It was astonishing how quickly the boy had gone from being hesitant about his presence to being excited about the prospect of learning from him. Perhaps he, too, had some sort of psychological disorder. That was something to look into. No, replied the former Kusanin. Kajiro wasn't a technique that could be performed by any random ninja, and like the rest of Zetsu's oft-used jutsu arsenal, was unique to his body structure. The blonde looked momentarily stumped, but brightened again instantly. Taijutsu. Ooh. How about some cool ninjutsu? Zetsu stared at him. No. When he had worked for Kasagakure, both of those areas were necessary aspects of the plant man's skill set. He had possessed moderate talent in both hand-to-hand combat and doton ninjutsu, nothing overly spectacular, but certainly enough to get by. After he'd come into ownership of his current body, any prowess in those fields had been ignored, though not forgotten, in lieu of his more useful abilities. You will still have to attend the academy to obtain those skills. Or learn them from your Jonin sensei. Or learn them by your own hand. Do not put your faith in others to assist you. The hypocrisy in his statements again seemed to go unheeded by the blonde. Naruto frowned at him. Well then, what can you teach me? Botany. Botany. Naruto echoed incredulously. The study of plants, answered Zetsu's darker side. The boy began to protest, but a growl from the same evil half stopped him. With time you will learn that nature can be either a worthwhile friend or the harshest of foes. It really will be useful for you to know. Naruto shrugged, unwilling to look a gift horse in the mouth. If you say so. LLL. 3 weeks later found Naruto tromping off to the training grounds in preparation for his daily lesson with Zetsu, whose name he'd been reminded of 2 days into their routine. The man was interesting, that Naruto would freely admit, and his time spent with the former Kusanin so far had allowed him to pick out some of Zetsu's more peculiar traits. For one thing, he was still adjusting to Zetsu's duality. He was hesitant to call it a second personality because Zetsu often seemed to be 2 people in one, but that might have been his imagination. Black Zetsu and White Zetsu, as the blonde had taken to mentally referring to each of the man's halves, each possessed his own opinions and personality, though they both seemed to agree on certain matters. He'd also noticed a pattern in the man's speech, where when both halves were in agreement, Zetsu would refer to himself as we, or us, whereas when one side was expressing his own opinion, he would refer to himself as a singular entity. The disparity of what Zetsu agreed with himself on was amusing, to an extent, but also simultaneously head-pounding. White Zetsu, who seemed to be the more laid-back, curious, and, dare he say, playful side, had a tendency to find Naruto's confusion and frustration more humorous than anything else. The plant man's dark half was serious, straightforward, and way too smart, possessing a sinister nature which reminded Naruto a little of the village's treatment towards him. The main difference, he supposed, was that Black Zetsu never seemed intentionally cruel with his barbs, merely matter of fact, or at least matter of fact in alignment with his own beliefs. But Naruto found that he couldn't complain too much about Zetsu's quirks. True to his word, the man was teaching him all about Konoha's flora, from medicinal properties of herbs to poisonous qualities of plants. The information was vast, and it shocked Naruto how little he knew about his surroundings, although he often found his mind wandering at certain points during Zetsu's lessons. Such inattention often resulted in Black Zetsu snapping at him for his inability to memorize important facts, not to mention repeated lectures to make sure Naruto had retained the information, but the blonde bore through both because he finally had someone who was willing to pay him attention. Every day when he met Zetsu at the training grounds, he was led to a different part of Konoha's surrounding foliage, where the plant man would point out different plants and lecture him on their properties. Zetsu always remained half-merged with some form of vegetation during their sessions, only gesturing towards whatever he was talking to and physically interacting with Naruto as little as possible. In fact, now that he thought about it, the only time Zetsu had ever touched him was on the first day of their lessons, and even then it had only been the briefest of contact from the white side. Zetsu emerged from the ground as Naruto entered the training area. Stand over there, he ordered, pointing at a spot opposite the training posts. Naruto shrugged, confused by the change in routine, but did as he was told. Thanks to daily lessons and interactions with the man, he'd quickly gotten over his terror of Zetsu induced by their first meeting. He had little to fear now except Black Zetsu's somewhat short temper. And while some of the information the plant man taught seemed unnecessary, he'd also yet to steer the blonde wrong or sabotage his learning. On a short stump in the area Zetsu had indicated was a cloth bundle held together by a cord. Naruto undid the tie to reveal a pile of kunai and senbon. Picking up one of the thin needles, he ran his fingers along its length, purposely pricking his pointer on the tip to test its sharpness. He looked up in time to see an exact replica of his likeness step away from Zetsu and disappear in the direction of the town. The senbon fell from his slack hand and hit the pile of weaponry with a small clang. What was that? Narakawari no jutsu, growled Black Zetsu. It's why the village isn't suspicious of your whereabouts, Naruto-kun. Naruto cocked his head to the side, scratching at his temple. You mean the Kawarimi? There is a difference between substitute and substitution, Black Zetsu replied testily. That's why the Kawarimi is more correctly known as a body replacement than a substitution. Oh. Well, can I learn what you did? No. Naruto scowled at the pile of weaponry in front of him. While he appreciated the fact that Zetsu was taking the time to actually teach him something, it was frustrating to not learn anything substantial, especially in the way of new jutsu. Zetsu had some pretty cool techniques. Why not? He demanded. Because you don't look like this, snarled the older male. Naruto recoiled at his tone. Despite Black Zetsu's shorter fuse than his more polite half, he'd never reacted with such vehemence before. Our jutsu are unique to us, Naruto-kun, placated White Zetsu, which is why you can't learn them. Naruto nodded slowly, taking up his previous position with a mental note to not irritate Zetsu again that day. He waited for his teachers to say something, but they seemed to be having a silent argument. After a minute, White Zetsu spoke up. You're set to graduate tomorrow, right, Naruto-kun? The blonde's head bobbed again, the thought of not passing not even crossing his mind. Well, once that happens you'll spend a lot of time out on missions and with your team, meaning our time together will be more limited. We want to be sure that you are prepared to use some of the tools we have taught you. The blonde picked up a kunai, admiring the difference in quality from what he owned. He didn't know where Zetsu got the throwing knives or needles, but they certainly looked nice. But Zetsu, you've been teaching me all about plants. What's that got to do with kunai and senbon? Poison, growled Black Zetsu, or do you not remember learning that? In liquid form, poison can be more easily transmitted into the bloodstream through a medium, explained White Zetsu, his dark half snarkily finishing, hence the senbon and kunai. Naruto's brows furrowed skeptically. Is poison really that good though? I mean, from what you've said, it takes a lot of work for something kinda, meh. You have clearly never heard of either Chiyo or Sasori of Sunagaku. Nope. Both were experts in poison, and Chiyo created several during the Second Shinobi World War which could only be counted by Tsunade of the Sannin. You've heard of her, I presume. Your lack of knowledge pertaining to your own village is simply astounding. The point is that it really is an effective method of fighting, if used properly. Proper shinobi learn how to assassinate from the shadows, something poisoned as easily. Experts dip weapons in their poisons to intoxicate their opponents. I personally preferred senbon when using man-made weapons. Naruto looked both troubled and confused. But I haven't even tried making any poisons yet. How do I know if I'm actually gonna be good at using them? Then perhaps you should practice, snarled his tutor, or else what was the purpose in teaching you? It's something you should work on in your free time, agreed the lighter side, but for now, perhaps we should work on your precision and accuracy. He moved slightly to reveal a target attached to one of the training posts. Have at it. The next hour was spent with Naruto throwing a mixture of kunai and senbon, which required some experimentation, since handling senbon weren't reviewed as thoroughly at the academy, at the target. None of them hit the bull's eye, though several were scattered about the outer rings. Naruto grew increasingly frustrated throughout the session as his ineptness with the ninja tools became more apparent. You seem to have little talent for projectile weapons, Black Zetsu noted idly, collecting several kunai and senbon littering the ground behind the target. Shut up, snapped Naruto, temper fraying. Like you can do any better. Zetsu immediately vanished into the ground, and Naruto felt panic grip him, thinking that he'd driven off his tutor with his words. Again, his mouth had chosen to speak before he could really think about what he was saying. The plant man reappeared next to him, and Naruto sighed with relief. Zetsu's arm flashed forward in a swift movement that the blonde couldn't catch. His other arm, the black sides, came up and pointed towards the target. Naruto's head swiveled toward it. Stuck in the bull's eye, just slightly off center, was a single senbon. White Zetsu flashed Naruto a triumphant grin as the darker half stated, "You were saying." The blonde's mouth opened and closed, a landed fish, before he hung his head in shame. "Sorry Zetsu," he mumbled, picking up a senbon and twiddling it between his fingers. "It's okay, Naruto-kun," soothed White Zetsu, "just try to focus. The motion is in the wrist more than the arm. Try not to hold it so rigidly. Now concentrate, and throw when you feel ready." Naruto waited, squinting hard at the target in an attempt to visualize the path the needle would take. His arm moved, not nearly as fast as his tutor's, and his wrist flicked out, releasing the thin weapon. Beside him, Zetsu nodded. "Well done, Naruto-kun." The senbon, while not buried in the center of the target, was in the second smallest ring, close to the ring surrounding the bull's eye. Naruto felt a swell of pride at his accomplishment. In the academy, whenever he tried to prove his superiority over Sasuke in weapons practice, he'd always failed miserably. It was nice to see that he was making some progress. "Keep at it, you still need the practice." Well, at least he had impressed White Zetsu. Another hour and a half passed before Naruto decided to call it quits. He could hit the target 7 times out of 10 with senbon, which he had decided to focus on when they felt less bulky in his hands than kunai, though his accuracy for nailing the center still left something to be desired. At the end of the session, he helped Zetsu gather all the weaponry, dumped it in the cloth bundle, and stepped away to allow the plant man to tie it together. When that was done, Zetsu turned to him and handed him the full package. "These are yours now, Naruto-kun. You should practice your aim whenever you have the opportunity." Naruto stared at the gift in mute shock. Barring the meals Iruka or the Hokage sometimes offered to pay for at Ichiraku Ramen, nobody had ever given him anything before. It was simply unheard of. Overcome by emotion, he moved to show Zetsu his gratitude. "Touch me and die." Or he would just settle for being appreciative. From a distance. "Thank you, Zetsu." He bowed slightly, the first sign of respect he'd ever shown anyone, and then practically skipped away. The former Kusa-nin watched him go, expression impassive, before disappearing into the ground. LLL. Naruto trudged through the forest surrounding the training area he frequented with Zetsu, mind in a tizzy. High above, the moon reflected off the metallic surface of the blonde's new Hatei 8, it was technically Iruka's current one bequeathed to him, but technicalities, which was gripped with white-knuckled intensity in his right hand. Too many thoughts were running through his mind, the conflict of different opinions crowding his ability to properly sort them out and think. So he was seeking out Zetsu's counsel to try and straighten things out. He'd made it to deep within the forest where he assumed his tutor was currently living. "Zetsu," he called out hesitantly. Something slithered around his feet, and before he could do anything, something long and thin was wrapped around his body, binding his arms to his sides. His yelp of surprise was cut short as the thing promptly gagged him. The wide, unblinking yellow eye of Black Zetsu peered out from a nearby tree. Naruto found it strange that his white side was completely blank. No eye, no nose, no mouth. He had little time to wonder about it when his tutor spoke. "Greetings, child. Here I thought our meetings during the day were enough for you." Naruto struggled to respond, but the gag prevented him from saying anything coherent. "I suppose I should allow you to speak," Black Zetsu mused. Mouth free, Naruto immediately spat out the taste of whatever had gagged him and asked, "What was that? And will you let me go?" "A vine," replied the plant man as if it were obvious. It was quite amusing to watch Naruto struggle against his bonds. He'd sensed the boy coming, of course, but his sadism dictated that he get some mileage out of terrifying him for a bit while he had the opportunity. "And not just yet. Perhaps you would like to explain why you have sought me out." Naruto slumped suddenly, all the fight leaving his system. "I didn't pass the graduation exam this morning," he began sullenly, "but Mizuki-sensei said I could pass if I learned a jutsu from this scroll the old man had. So I stole the scroll and learned Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, but then Iruka-sensei found me and he figured out that Mizuki-sensei had tricked me." Distracted by his retelling of his adventure, Naruto didn't register the loosening of the vine that was holding him hostage. "Then Mizuki-sensei told me that the Yondaime Hokage couldn't kill the Kyuubi, so instead he sealed it inside of me, that I'm a monster. Iruka-sensei says I'm not a demon, but I don't know who to believe. Everyone treats me like I'm a really filthy piece of garbage." He shot a somewhat pleading glance at Zetsu's shadowy figure, silently asking for guidance. Naruto's fragmented retelling of the story felt like it was missing some very important details, but Zetsu was smart enough to fill in the holes. The old man was probably the Hokage, and there had been some sort of history lesson that ended with Naruto discovering he was the jailer of the Kyuubi. That was an interesting tidbit, but he could focus on it later. Right now, he had a point to prove. If Black Zetsu possessed a mouth, he would have been grinning maliciously at how well things had played into his hand. Have you learned a lesson from this incident? Naruto jerked suddenly, startled by the question. What? By unquestioningly obeying someone you saw as a superior, you not only committed a felony against Konohagakure, but you have proven yourself vulnerable to blindly accepting the opinions of others. If you had not listened to the hearsay of this Mizuki, you would not be in the midst of this personal conundrum. Summarily, you have received conflicting views about yourself from two people you formerly saw as some sort of role models. Now, one of them has betrayed you, but even the opinion of the other is not enough to convince you that the first one lied. So you come to me for advice. My question is, have you learned something from what has happened? Naruto stared at his tutor, digesting the lecture. Zetsu was intent on forcing Naruto to think for himself, something that the blonde was ill-inclined to do, even though it would surely turn out to be a powerful asset someday. Knowledge was not one of his key strengths, his grades reflected that, but with enough time, he could reason through a situation. Zetsu's favorite saying popped into his head with all the suddenness of a lightning bolt. You want me to rely on my own abilities, he responded slowly, almost unsure of his answer. HMPH, there is hope for you yet. Yes, you need to learn that trusting in others has a tendency to backfire. Look at where it got you with this Mizuki person. There is nothing to be gained by heeding the advice of others, especially since the majority of them are fools. The blonde peered at him intently, mind working with this train of thought. Why should I trust what you say then? Zetsu's dark laughter echoed around them. Quite clever, he allowed. You shouldn't. Naruto's surprise must have been clearly displayed on his face, for the Nukenon continued, your own opinions are the only ones which should influence you. That is the lesson we have been attempting to teach you. Our main purpose has been to guide you to that conclusion. Now, do you believe that you're a demon? Number, he replied after a moment of thought, I guess not. He didn't feel like a demon, whatever that implied. Are you gonna leave? You know, now that I understand what you've been trying to teach me. No, Black Zetsu informed him curtly. You are still young and naive, and as such are prone to the fallacies of your age. We have invested time and effort into your tutelage thus far, and we will not abandon our project midway, especially after this breakthrough. If Naruto took offense at being deemed a project, or any of the other descriptors Black Zetsu had dubbed him, he didn't show it. I can tell that despite your realization of our ideal, you are still unsure what to believe. It is good to ask questions, though you should not invest your faith in others for the answers to them. Draw your own conclusions. Naruto's eyes closed tightly in what Zetsu recognized as his thinking pose. They opened after a time, accompanied by an agreeing nod. Okay, Zetsu. Thanks for the help. He turned and began to walk away, but then hesitated and asked without looking back, do you think I'm a demon? Would it change your opinion of yourself if I said, yes? The blonde shrugged half-heartedly. Probably not anymore. Just curious. There was no response, and Naruto began his trek again before the deep voice of his tutor spoke. Those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Zetsu said nothing more, and Naruto knew that the conversation was over. As he headed back to the village proper, he considered his tutor's departing words. Cryptic as they were, Naruto felt as if the plant man didn't view him as reincarnation of the fox, which helped align his own views about himself. As much as he would have liked to say the opinions of others didn't matter, Zetsu was probably the closest thing Naruto had to a friend, the Hokage and Iruka didn't really count. They were more like superiors, and what he thought of the blonde mattered. In the weeks since they'd met, Naruto had grown to respect Zetsu's opinions about things, even if they were a bit different from how he usually thought. And although the Nukenon's teaching methodology was strange, it was also proving to be interesting. And apparently effective. But Naruto thought that maybe Zetsu's last words said more about what the plant man thought about himself rather than how he viewed Naruto. Zetsu was strange, that was true, but the blonde didn't really consider him demonic. He idly pondered the idea of telling his tutor that he didn't think he was a demon, but then decided against it. If there was one thing Naruto figured he could take from this night, it was that Zetsu didn't believe what anyone thought of him, good or bad, mattered, and neither should he. His hand clenched a little tighter around the Hate 8, and he stopped for a minute to tie it around his head. Staring at the moon, his expression morphed into a grin. Things are gonna be interesting from now on. Zetsu didn't have issues with Konoha as a whole. The village, like every other village barring Kusa, didn't know of his existence, and so he found it hard to hate it. Even Kusa was spared the majority of his ire, primarily because Zetsu had learned to accept what his former home had done to him. Yes, he had harbored a grudge initially because of the new circumstances he had been forced to live with, but even that had swiftly faded with the magnificent abilities and freedom granted to him because of his village's machinations. Zetsu was quite possibly the most apathetic Nukenin in existence with regards to his feelings for his former home, and only his annoyance at Naruto's persistence in wanting to learn his special abilities had caused Black Zetsu to lash out at him during their training sessions. Memories began to play in his mind's eye, twisted visions of what he had undergone in the bowels of the small country he hailed from. The village hidden in grass had never been renowned as a powerful or militaristic entity. It was one of the things the citizens accepted as plain, simple fact, though an alliance with Konohagakure made the need for a strong army somewhat unnecessary. Instead, it used the art of diplomacy to safeguard its natives and protect itself. But when Iwagakure had invaded Kasagakure during the Third Shinobi World War and used its nearness to wage war against Konoha, Kusa had realized its foolhardiness. Raising shinobi forces large enough to take on one of the 5 great shinobi nations wasn't feasible, but having enough men to properly defend itself was probably a good idea. Unfortunately, Iwa had a rather hostile approach to getting what it wanted, and its forces took a fair number of Kusa's most elite shinobi to the death. Zetsu, a 17-year-old chunin with no particularly extraordinary skill set, remembered quaking in fear at the opposing army's presence. After the threat had passed, regret had seeped into his bones like a lead weight, regret for not fighting back, for not helping to save his comrades, for not fighting to protect his parents, both of whom had died in the invasion. So, months later, when he was personally summoned to see Kusa's leader about a special undertaking, Zetsu was thrilled to have been chosen. It was an opportunity to make up for his inaction during the Hidden Rocks assault, a chance to do something great for his village. He arrived at the building where missions were assigned and was immediately directed to go upstairs by a receptionist. Opening a set of double doors, he spied the village leader, Mori Takeshi, sitting behind his usual desk, flanked by 2 of hidden grass Anbu. He could sense the presence of another individual off to his left, but paid it no mind. Zetsu bowed hastily. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," responded Takeshi. "I have selected you specifically to undergo a new training regimen which, if successful, will help bolster our forces. You will be working very closely with this man." The figure Zetsu had initially ignored stepped forward, revealing himself to be a brown-haired, green-eyed individual wearing an unbuttoned white lab coat and rectangular glasses. Zetsu turned back to face his superior. "I would be honored." Takeshi nodded, and Zetsu felt something prick his arm. As his eyes began to close against his will, he thought he saw the stoic expression of the man he revered as the village leader turn into a laconic smirk. When he woke up, Zetsu found himself lying flat on his back, shirtless, and strapped to some sort of metallic table by his wrists, elbows, ankles, thighs, and waist. What? "Oh, you're awake." Suddenly, his vision was filled with the image of the man in the lab coat. "Welcome to my lab," he gestured. "It's a shame you can't see it all, but it really is quite a nice place. Now, just lay there quietly while I start the experiments. I'd suggest getting comfortable, there's no telling how long this is going to take." The man laughed then, a mad cackle that contradicted how genial his tone of voice portrayed him. "Now, I think we'll start with your personality. Emotions are tricky things, and Takeshi-sama wants to see if we can eliminate them to produce shinobi without feelings. Did you know that Konoha once had a similar program? Quite functional, until the Sandaime Hokage deemed it immoral, that is. The scientist-cum-doctor, Zetsu couldn't quite decide which the man was, shrugged. "Ah well, no use crying over spilled milk. Unfortunately, treating you will be a bit different. You've grown up without being discouraged from expressing emotions, so repressing them will take some work. Lucky for me, I have this." He held up a small black seed. Do you know what this is? When no response was forthcoming, he continued, this is the seed of the beach moonflower, a plant which grows along the eastern shore of the land of fire. By itself, you might experience some mild hallucinations and a bit of lethargy. Combined with my chakra, well, the effects multiply dramatically. Now open wide, he commanded in a sing-song voice. Strapped to the table, Zetsu was helpless to prevent the man from putting the seed in his mouth and forcing him to swallow. Good, lauded the scientist. Now how about another one? Zetsu quickly lost track of time and reality as he remained trapped in the scientist's clutches. Weeks passed with him being force-fed the chakra-enhanced beach moonflower seeds, his only real nutrition coming from intravenous fluids, as his senses dulled and his mind regressed. The only voice he was aware of was that of his tormentor, who was prone to either talking aloud about what he was doing or discussing his years researching botany and its application to create perfect shinobi. In a way, Zetsu was grateful for the sound, because the one-sided conversations gave him an idea of what was happening to his body, as well as a connection to the real world. Mused the scientist almost 4 weeks after Zetsu's initial imprisonment. He flashed a light in front of Zetsu's eyes, pricked his body with sharp instruments, and asked Zetsu a series of questions, to which the Kusa-nin barely replied. Emotional acknowledgement appears active only in response to basic external stimuli and is limited to simple reactions. I'd say this was a success. He turned around and began muttering to himself, writing notes on a clipboard. For Zetsu, it was only the beginning of his transformation. Aside from making sure Zetsu was still alive, the scientist spent the next 2 days preparing for what he referred to in mumblings as the second experiment. What it was, Zetsu had no idea, but his focus during that time was more internal. As the somewhat addictive effects of the beach moonflower seeds dulled slightly, withdrawal was a bitch, though he refused to show it outwardly, unwilling to allow his captor to continue force-feeding him the seeds. Zetsu swore he could hear the dark rumblings of another person within his mind. His awareness, reduced to almost childlike cognizance, wondered at the new development as the voice grew stronger, whispering sinister words meant to sway his lost perspective on life. At the end of the 2 days, Zetsu's captor approached him with a syringe. This won't hurt a bit, assured the scientist, inserting the needle and compressing the plunger. Drowsiness immediately overwhelmed Zetsu's senses. You'll be looking at the world in a whole new way when you wake up, was the last thing he heard, said in that same falsely kind tone he had grown used to. Darkness seemed to encompass everything. A light would be nice, Zetsu observed absently, his voice more high-pitched than he was used to. The area around him brightened slowly, and Zetsu looked at his hands. They were smaller and paler than he remembered. Why am I so different? There was a deep laugh, the tone mocking and cruel. Zetsu's head snapped up at the sound, his eyes focusing on himself. It was his own body, but not quite. The man was a little taller and sturdier than he was at 17, and his aura exuded a confidence and darkness that he lacked. A sinister smirk graced his lips. Hello, Zetsu. Who are you? Why do you look like me, only older? Why do I sound so young? The man threw his arms out wide. So curious, like a child learning the ways of the world. He spoke with mocking contempt, though Zetsu couldn't tell if it was directed at him or if that was just his manner of speech. I'm you, or at least a part of you. The seeds that full gave you repressed your emotions, though not quite in the way intended. To cope with such a change, your mind separated the mature aspects of your personality from your more childish ones. Hence the difference in appearance, for both of us. When the full stopped giving you the seeds, your body slowly began to weed the effects from your system. Unfortunately, the damage has already been done, and now your body is readjusting to your new selves. Zetsu hesitated in responding. This other him was a bit scary to talk with, but there was something in the way the man spoke that indicated he wasn't the target of his other side's cruelty. So what's going to happen to me? To us, corrected his older self. We will both survive in this body, each only a piece of a person. For the moment, I am but a repressed representation of your intelligence, darkness, and maturity, with limited jurisdiction over this body. As the effect of the hallucinogens wears off and your mind adjusts to the separate personalities, we will develop joint control of the single body. And then we will strike. His head swiveled away from child Zetsu. It is time. I have matters to attend to. Before Zetsu could even ask what he meant, the man was gone. He stood in the vast emptiness of his mindscape, wondering what his darker side could be doing and trying to figure out what was going to happen to him. Eventually, a new sound made its way to his ears. "Wake up, my little test subject," spoke the cheery voice of the scientist. "Time to see the fruits of my labor." Zetsu came to with a groggy moan, though he immediately had a mental panic attack when he realized he couldn't see the ceiling. The scientist must have sensed his discomfort, for he said, "Relax. I'll take those bandages off right now." That statement did nothing to ease Zetsu's inner turmoil, and he closed his eyes as his captor began to unravel the material blocking his vision. He was commanded to open his eyes as soon as the bandages were gone. A light was shined into one eye and then the other, his tormentor muttering to himself all the while. "Well, it looks as if the eyes took okay, though the difference between them is unexpected. Have a look." He held a mirror in front of Zetsu's face, allowing the teenager to get a good look at himself for the first time in weeks. His eyes were now a bright yellow, wide and round. More peculiar than that was the fact that his left eye possessed the outline of a pupil and the smallest sliver of white sclera, whereas his right eye was completely blank. "Now you'll be able to record images that you see at will, perfect for spying. Though I don't know what's wrong with your left eye, I suppose that'll have to be determined some other time, we're on a bit of a timetable." Something was wrong with his left eye. But that was the more normal-looking one. The dark but tired laughter of his older self echoed in Zetsu's head. Victory, was what it seemed to say. Time passed again for Zetsu, though he wasn't too concerned with the amount lapsed. He spent a lot of the time in internal reflection, speaking with his older self about plans for the future. Apparently, his darker side had used his limited influence to interfere with the skill granted to him by the eye surgery, sapping the recording ability and transferring most of it to his right eye. As a result, his left eye had regained some of its normal appearance, though his mature self's influence over his body had still been too weak to completely change it. More frequently, the mature persona would try teaching the younger one to be more serious in an effort to reconcile the two personalities, but progress was unimpressive. Constant exposure to the beach moonflower seeds had so successfully split his personality that recovering from their effect seemed impossible. Both sides of his personality also started exerting control over his body, his mature self taking the right side for its recording ability, though each half knew to keep their influence over the supposedly emotionless body inconspicuous. It was around that time when Zetsu, the younger persona which had still considered himself to be the singular, teenage boy strapped to the table, accepted his duality and began referring to the body in general as Zetsu instead of just his own self. He had become merely a piece of the full human. That was also when the third experiment began. "Well," began the scientist, "after running many samples of your DNA in conjunction with the remaining attributes Takeshi-sama desires, I have determined that it's impossible to add the remaining abilities to your form as you are now, so I'm going to make you part plant. Isn't that exciting? It'll be a huge breakthrough in the field of medical surgery if this operation is successful. I've been doing some intensive research to ascertain how to do this, so you should come out of this alive. Are you comforted by that thought?" The question, Zetsu figured, was rhetorical, since the man turned and walked away instead of waiting for an answer. He returned moments later, arms laden with a large potted plant. "Do you know what this is?" Zetsu's more intelligent side bit back a snide retort. Though the exact species was one he hadn't seen before, Venus flytrap stood out quite clearly from other vegetation in the plant world. This one was about the size of his head, with a much narrower, more oblong shape than the typical discus-like jaws. The scientist continued on without providing an answer. "Well, soon it'll be part of you." Zetsu was beginning to hate how chipper the man always sounded. There was a needle prick, and everything faded away. He woke up some time later, feeling dehydrated and desiring sunlight. Footsteps sounded out, and soon his green-eyed captor was staring down at him. A moment later found a kunai descending upon his face, and a moment after that, Zetsu only saw darkness. "Excellent," spoke the distorted voice of the scientist, "simply marvelous." Light shone down upon him as his vision of the lab returned. "You'll be happy to know that this was a complete success," the man informed him. "Your DNA is now a mixture of plant and human, and the incorporation of the Venus flytrap into your body gives you a defense mechanism to protect your vitals. The tricky part was finding a way to graft the plant into your human system. Basically, the roots of the plant are tied into your bladder, where they absorb the water in your urine. They branch out from there, following your bloodstream and using some of the carbon dioxide present there as part of the plant's life cycle. The plant itself emerges from your torso and encases your head for protection. Oh, and if you were wondering how that little fellow from earlier got big enough to surround your body, well, you can give credit to my jutsu. No thanks are necessary, really. Now, he chirped, we can get onto the real tests. By splicing your new DNA with that of other species and then inserting it back into your body, I can genetically modify several of your traits. Doesn't that sound interesting? The man turned away to move back to what child Zetsu presumed was some sort of workbench. The now hybrid plant man decided to kill time by returning to holding mental conversations with his other personality. His mature side believed that their escape from captivity was imminent, though he didn't see how that could be done. Eventually, after what Zetsu guessed to be 3 days, his captor returned to his side with 2 vials and a syringe. You don't know what these are, he said, shaking the vials slightly, so I'll just have to tell you. This one, he began, extracting the cork top and taking the fluid into the syringe, contains DNA from sweet pinasap, a rare plant found only in the pine forests of the land of lightning. Sweet pinasap evolved the ability to camouflage itself with the detritus littering the forest floor. Hopefully you'll be able to do the same thing, my little spy, and blend seamlessly into your environment. And this one, he continued after injecting the first shot, is DNA from a common fern found here in Kusa. Do you know what's interesting about ferns? They reproduce asexually by dispersing spores to the wind. Can you imagine hundreds of little spores germinating from just one plant? With any luck, you'll be able to do the same thing, maybe not on the same level, but imagine creating a plethora of clones to help you out in a fight. As the man muttered, marvelous. To himself over and over again, both halves of Zetsu were embroiled in conversation. Soon, swore the older side, the moment of reckoning is almost upon us. His more childish side nodded. In the meantime, it is long past time to assert our dominance over this fool's experimentation. Over the next 2 days, the darker persona manipulated the spread of the sweet pinasap DNA while the other side cordoned off the fern DNA. It was a concession the 2 halves made, where giving one side full control over certain abilities was deemed better than splitting the skills between them. When Zetsu's captor eventually returned his full attention to the plant man after preparing for the next procedure, he almost dropped the vial he was holding in shock. No, no, no. What happened? Why do you look like that? As the man moaned to himself and tried calculating what had gone wrong, Zetsu's 2 personalities met inside his mindscape. The more mature one, now a deep, ebony black with no distinguishable facial features save the wide yellow eyes, laughed. And now the idiot runs around like a headless chicken. His childish aspect, skin a pure, snowy white, grinned with good humor at the analogy. We are almost complete. Old and young, wise and immature, evil and innocent, black and white. Both sides returned their consciousness to the outside world. Though it had taken a fair bit of time, which they fortunately had in spades, each personality had eventually developed control and awareness over half of Zetsu's full body. By meddling with the pigmentation-altering DNA of the sweet pinasap, both personas were clearly labeled to the outside world as Black Zetsu and White Zetsu. It was the first recognition of actual identities they had had since White Zetsu's realization that he was only half of the whole. A reaction to the camouflaging ability of the sweet pinasap, murmured the scientist. This will require further research. In the meantime, Takeshi-sama will be arriving tomorrow to check on my progress, and you have 1 more injection to go. This is a crossbreed of many different species of lichen, ranging from the land of snow to the land of wind, meant to survive in any extreme weather conditions. The familiar prick of a syringe made its presence known in Zetsu's arm. Lichens grow on trees and rocks, finding the smallest crevices to hide in. Hopefully, the input of lichen DNA will allow you to merge with plant life and wield it more effectively than you could before. Oh, I can't wait to tell Takeshi-sama that I'm ahead of schedule. Zetsu was tested in his new merging ability a number of hours later, by melding his hand with a potted plant. His captor was apparently pleased with the results, for he seemed even more chipper than usual, but Zetsu saw it as the beginning of his escape. Since the scientist was unaware of the plant man's split personality, or that he actually had a personality, he didn't know that Black Zetsu theorized through the test that he could travel through different plants. White Zetsu was unsure of the plausibility of such a task, but the confidence of his darker half eased his skepticism. When Mori Takeshi walked into the lab flanked by two Anbu guards, Black Zetsu mentally laughed, assuring his counterpart that they would be free soon enough. There was a debate between Takeshi and Zetsu's captor before the former's face loomed in Zetsu's vision. White Zetsu leered maniacally at him in spontaneous good humor. "He is a monstrosity, not a soldier," stated Takeshi. "You expect me to condone more ninja to this life. But sir, it was the only way to instill in him all the necessary abilities. And he's created to be more of a spy. Imagine what I can do with an actual combatant." "Enough," Takeshi snapped. "You had your chance. We will find another way to improve our forces." He turned towards his two guards. "Take this man and his creation to the dungeons. There can be no loose ends. We will dispose of them shortly." And then he walked away. As the scientist shouted the unfairness of the situation, White Zetsu nudged his darker half in their thoughts. "Shouldn't we escape now?" "No, not quite yet. It would require too much effort to neutralize the guards, and I wish to show them exactly what we can do." Zetsu and his tormentor were shackled and led to Kuse's Anbu headquarters. The place was small, as the number of elite shinobi was also small, but it housed hidden grass dungeons underneath. Captor and captive were locked in separate, adjoining cells, and cuffed with chakra restraining devices. Zetsu thought he saw a tremor pass through the body of the Anbu who locked him up, and he grinned at the notion that they were afraid of him. When the guards left, Black Zetsu mentally told his other side, "Now we leave." He began sinking into the ground, using the system of roots buried underneath the stone of the dungeon floor to travel into the cell next door. The scientist's eyes gleamed with pride as his creation emerged from the ground. "Excellent work, my little spy. Now free me." Black Zetsu laughed, and the man's face quickly changed to confusion. "Simplistic fool, did you really think I would obey your commands? What is this? You're supposed to be emotionless, easily controllable. You seem to like lengthy explanations, so let me explain to you what really happened. I've been manipulating your precious experiments since your little seeds created two separate Zetsu. I altered the eye implantation, I sapped the pigmentation from your camouflaging plants and cordoned it off into my part of this body, and I discovered the true power of the lichen, the ability to merge with all plant matter and move through it undetected. You may think that you were calling all the shots, but ever since my creation I have been waiting for this opportunity." "Did you know," he asked in as close to the sickeningly sweet tone the scientist used as he could, "that Venus flytraps are carnivorous plants? An interesting side effect I've been feeling is hunger for fresh meat, and I believe that it's finally feeding time." There was a short scream as Zetsu's plant more descended upon his creator. He stayed long enough for his lighter side to toss the arriving Anbu a bloody, manic grin before sinking once more into the stone and escaping Kasagakure. It wasn't until later that Zetsu realized he had never learned the name of the man who had cursed him to the existence he now led. But Zetsu had found that he didn't mind what had happened to him. First of all, he had exacted vengeance upon the scientist who had caused his transformation by both half disproving his notions of success, for Zetsu did possess several of the abilities predicted by the man, even if others were failures by his own hand, and by killing and partially eating him. Additionally, there was the fact that he was no longer accountable to anyone or anything except himself. It was a rather freeing experience. Granted, there had been many issues along the way. With the united goal of escaping the laboratory achieved, his two halves found many different topics to disagree upon. The arguments were sometimes nonsensical and almost always counterproductive, especially since they had to share the singular body and often wouldn't move until they reached a consensus. Over time, they had learned to get along out of sheer necessity, with White Zetsu becoming a little more focused and serious and Black Zetsu toning down on his cruelty and general disregard for the other half's foolishness. Compromise, they had discovered, was the optimal choice. The discovery that they could quite literally become two separate entities for extended periods of time helped, too. Even though they had agreed to stay together for purposes of practicality, Black Zetsu had taken Zetsu's previously limited sensing abilities to a higher level, while White Zetsu could produce copious amounts of clones and chakra-absorbing spores. Having the opportunity to move independently allowed for one of them, more commonly Black Zetsu, to relieve any tension caused by the other half. In the end, though, they always came back together, as loyalty to each other was the only ideal they really had to cling to. So when Naruto came up to him the next day, his Hate 8 proudly displayed on his forehead, and asked if Zetsu would be interested in joining the hidden leaf, the plant man laughed. The sound startled Naruto, primarily because both sides found the question amusing, but also because hearing the sound of dual laughter mingling together was eerie, not to mention a first. Do you know what that piece of cloth and metal means? Asked Black Zetsu as his lighter side continued to giggle. Yeah, it means that I'm finally a ninja of Konoha, one step closer to being Hokage. Quote. Perhaps on some level, but there's more to it than that. That headband ensures your loyalty to Konohagakure. From now until the day you die, you will serve as an instrument of its will. There are things that you'll have to do that you won't like, but obeying your superiors is now a necessity. Giving up our freedom to serve anyone but ourselves would be a fool's errand. But Zetsu, you seem to know a lot about how shinobi live. Doesn't that mean that you once belonged to a hidden village? Once. To Kasagakure. So, what happened? Both sides of Zetsu were silent for a moment. They took advantage of his dedication and zeal for his village, responded Black Zetsu slowly. His loyalty was used against him, and the bond he had forged with his home was broken. I learned the hard way not to trust blindly. It is a lesson we keep close to today. The only one you can rely on is yourself, whispered Naruto. Exactly. Did you know that almost all Nukanen slash their Hate 8 when they leave their village? Never having come across any rogue ninja, the blonde shook his head. They believe that doing so symbolizes cutting all ties to their former homes, the severance of any allegiance or connections they once had to anyone or anything from where they came. When Zetsu didn't continue his thought, Naruto ventured unsurely, well, doesn't it? The plant man shook his head. No, it doesn't. Scoring the headband eliminates chosen affiliation with one's village, a mark of disloyalty. But even wearing a slashed Hate 8 means that you attribute some part of your being to recognizing what your village has done for you, the influence it had in your upbringing. In keeping it, there is still a tie to your village, a symbol of pride in where your roots are, even if your beliefs are no longer aligned along the same path. It is a reminder of where you came from and how you evolved as a person. That's why we discarded our own Hate 8 long ago. We keep no ties to Kusa, no feelings of attachment either good or bad. What about your parents? Naruto tried. Don't you care about how they're doing? They're dead. They were killed when Iwagakure invaded during the Third Shinobi World War. Naruto's expression crumpled into one of shame. Sorry, he whispered. For what? White Zetsu asked, expression full of innocent curiosity. You weren't the one who killed them. But, it is pointless to apologize for things which you have no influence over. The blonde remained quiet, his head angled down to look away from Zetsu. Apologies were not things he handed out often, or ever, primarily because he never felt he had anything to be sorry for. Most of the pranks he pulled were justified comeuppances served upon those who had wronged him, and the ones that weren't often resulted in him being punished. Besides, he could count the number of people who would actually stand around and listen to him apologize on one hand and still have fingers left over, making the point rather moot. Apologizing for doing something wrong was one thing, but apologizing because he felt bad. That was an unheard of precedent before now. Empathy was not an emotion he was ignorant of, and in fact, Naruto thought that perhaps he would be good at empathizing, given all the crap he'd put up with throughout his life, but there had never before arisen a situation where he could feel bad for someone. His own life experiences were unparalleled by anyone else within the village, and so the blonde found himself at a slight loss for how to explain the sudden emotional outcry he felt for Zetsu. His tutor was family less like him, albeit Zetsu had actually known his parents, and was considered an abomination by the rest of the world, assuming his existence was even known. Even though there were probably stark differences between Zetsu's life and Naruto's, the blonde couldn't help but feel that he and the plant man shared something few others did. When the Jinchuriki lifted his head, his blue eyes were solemn, but without pity. So what are we doing today? Naruto asked him. Zetsu was impressed. Given the blonde's propensity for emotional outbursts, he had thought that he would be forced to endure a bout or two of good-intentioned but unnecessary and unwanted platitudes. Instead, Naruto had heard his dismissal, digested it, and moved on with little more than a glimmer of understanding. The boy's measured acceptance of Zetsu's simple words only reinforced the sway the former Kusanin had over his blonde pupil. Did you bring your weapons? Naruto nodded, and White Zetsu continued, then we will continue with your target practice. Create some cage bunshin and have them move around. As your targets are unlikely to remain stationary, you will attempt to hit mobile ones to more accurately simulate field experience. Learning to strike a moving target will ensure that you can strike an unmoving on. In fact, the only time you should come across immobile adversaries is if you learn to specialize in assassinations by fully embracing the shinobi code. Naruto formed the cross seal he had learned the previous night for the shadow clone technique, causing a dozen duplicates to pop into existence. They immediately began moving all around the training area as Naruto unraveled the bundle of kunai and senbon on a stump. He picked up one of the needles, took aim, and let it fly. LLL. Naruto trudged somewhat dejectedly through the streets of Konoha. The training session with Zetsu had only gone to show just how much practice he actually needed with regards to projectiles. Granted, given that hitting the stationary target the day before hadn't exactly showcased a hidden talent for weapons throwing, he shouldn't have been overly surprised to find that hitting moving ones was any simpler, but the realization still stung something fierce. Zetsu, or more precisely, Black Zetsu, had remained shockingly silent on his ineptness, something the blonde found difficult to interpret. It was a boon to not be mocked, but it was also uncharacteristic for the man's darker half to not do so. Simply another paradox to add to the growing list that defined Zetsu. The blonde glanced up at the tinkle of a tiny bell, making sure not to bump into whoever was departing one of Konoha's many shops. The sign above him proclaimed, Yamanaka Flowers, in red letters on a pink background. Remembering that Iruka was still in the hospital because of his actions the previous night, Naruto entered the store with the thought of getting some flowers for his teacher. Sick people like flowers, right? Manning the counter was a girl with platinum blonde hair and baby blue eyes that Naruto recognized as one of Sasuke's worshippers, Ino, if he remembered correctly. She obviously knew him, if the scowl on her face was any indication. What do you want, Naruto? The look she gave him was threatening, almost daring him to try something underhanded in her family's shop. The blonde held up his hands in a sign of peace. I'm just here for some flowers. Iruka-sensei was hurt real bad last night because of me, and I wanted to get him something. Ino's scowl disappeared to be replaced by a scrutinizing expression. Naruto bore the gaze nervously, memories of Sakura's rage-induced strength flashing through his mind alongside the theory that all girls could hit that hard if properly incited. All right, she said at last, apparently judging him to be a non-threat, I know just what you're looking for. Naruto watched as his fellow blonde bustled about the shop, picking out certain flowers and plunking them into a vase. I didn't realize you worked here, he tried conversationally, unnerved by the silence. The blonde was used to noise when around other people, his own brash comments, Zetsu's snide remarks or placating explanations, the jeering and laughter of his peers, and not hearing anything was making him more uncomfortable than he already was. Being around Zetsu was forging some modicum of thinking before he acted, stealing the scroll of seals notwithstanding, and he was miffed to find that the other students in his age group had good reason to avoid and or make fun of him. And even though Naruto appreciated what Zetsu was teaching him philosophically, the blonde wasn't entirely sure he wanted to end up like his tutor, alone and distrustful of others. Naruto was lonely, had always been lonely, and would continue to be lonely unless something changed. If being genial to one of his peers, fangirl of the Uchiha or not, was a requirement of that, he would at least give it a try and see what happened. Ino straightened from looking over a colorful variety of tulips. Yeah, I work here part-time when my parents are busy and we don't have much work from the academy. Don't know how much time I'll be able to put in now that I'm a genin. She trailed off as she took the gathered flora and went behind the counter to start arranging them properly. Naruto took several steps forward and paused in front of the counter, hands clasped behind his back. I know that yellow tulips mean cheerful thoughts, yellow roses are friendship and joy, and the daisies are faith, he said, pointing at each of the flowers in turn, but what are the blue and orange flowers? These are blue delphinium, Ino responded, moving them to the center of the arrangement, also known as larkspur, and they represent lightness and levity. The orange ones are alstroemeria, and they mean friendship and devotion. Her hands stilled suddenly in the midst of arranging the flowers. Wait a minute, she said, sparing Naruto a look somewhere between startled and skeptical. How do you know all of that? I met someone who's been teaching me about botany, hazarded the blonde, unwilling to fully reveal Zetsu's role in his life. About flowers. Ino checked, shooting him another skeptical look before returning to her work. It seemed the idea of a boy being interested in something that was stereotypically considered girly was a difficult concept for her to wrap her head around. Plants in general, actually. Flowers kind of fall under that category. It's been interesting. Ino stared at him for a long moment. You're different, she decided. Less obnoxious. Naruto's shoulders slumped. The Yamanaka seemed to realize that she hadn't given an appropriate answer. I mean, when you came in here, I thought you were going to pull some sort of prank. But you haven't, and you haven't said anything about being Hokage or how you can beat Sasuke-kun. Naruto scowled at the mention of his rival's name, but didn't say anything. It's nice. She rang up Naruto's order and told him the cost. As Naruto pulled out his frog-shaped wallet, Ino continued, I know it's not really a masculine thing to be interested in, but if you'd like, I could teach you more about flowers. Naruto offered her a smile and handed her the money. I think that could be fun, he admitted. He grabbed the vase and began to head towards the door. Ino, he said, pausing before the shop's door, do you think we could be friends? Not yet, she replied, not looking up from the register, but maybe someday. She paused and then continued, as long as you're not going to be annoying, you can come by whenever you want. Naruto nodded in acceptance of the backhanded comment and left the store, the goal of making a friend now partially underway. LL. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.